So if you look at this image, basically it's the oldest game estimated at around 5,100 plus years. And looking at the image here, if you look at my pointer, so this is a typical board for Senate. Okay, like a, how should I say, it's kind of like a wooden table. It's like a game table at the time, and you can see how it looks like here in an ancient hieroglyph painting. And presumably these two people are, of course, royalty. Alright, now this kind of game table actually would only be created for very rich people. So are there only rich people playing Senate way back then in Egypt? No, because ordinary people also played it, but when they played it, they didn't actually have a game table. They just draw out the squares or the grid on a sand, and they basically use like rocks to play the little pieces. So you can do like a cheap version of it, but this is definitely the rich people's version. Very elaborate and very kind of well carved. And the other interesting thing to know about it is when the pharaoh, which is basically the Egyptian king or queen, when they die, during this period, how did game researchers or ancient historians find this game? Is because these Senate board game tables were buried in the tomb together with the Egyptian king or queen. So when they open the tomb and they find all the gold and all the very precious artifacts in the tomb, in the big kind of like place where they put all the dead bodies, or in the pyramids, which is where a lot of tombs are. So they found this example of the Senate board, and then they were trying to figure out what it is. So for quite a long time, I don't think people knew it was a game. They thought it was some kind of table to put stuff on, and then from the paintings they managed to figure it out. So it's a game that was played by both by both richer Egyptians as well as poorer Egyptians. But the core idea behind it is, or the core goal is, you have to advance your pieces, and your goal is to get off the board. You don't want to remain on the board. And what's the question of the day? So this is the question I will be asking for every ancient game. Yesterday I talked about stories. What do stories tell you about the people, about the culture? Why do we tell stories? And some of you had some really good answers. Entertainment, passing the time, but also to share the history, share the knowledge, and share the ideas of a community or a group of people. But games do the same thing in a rather indirect way. So what do games reveal about the culture? What do we know about the culture from the kind of game that we see? So the interesting thing about Senate is a game about moving through life and entering the afterlife. So life after death. And the goal of your play pieces is you're going to move through the board and you want to get out of the board. That means you don't want to remain in the board, on the board anymore. You want to move through all the grid squares, and the winner is the person who leaves that board. And the board is kind of like life. To leave the board, you're going into the afterlife. The faster you can go to the afterlife, the better. So it's an interesting concept, right? At that time, to think of Egyptian people, they don't see life as necessarily a worthy thing. It's more worthy to go to the life after death. And why do they think this? Is partly because of their king and their pharaoh system, because the pharaohs are seen as almost like godlike. So when they move to the afterlife, that's when they'll have eternal life and things like that. So that kind of concept that our life here is somewhat, meaningless, is just preparing us for a life after death. Now this is not very different from actually some religions in the world that believe this, including Christianity and of course Islam. So what is the famous modern day game that took inspiration from Senate? For those of you who like Tomb Raider, I remember one of you play a lot of Tomb Raider. I forgot now who. So if you like Tomb Raider, then this is an old Tomb Raider. Obviously you can see the graphics is the old school graphics. And this particular Tomb Raider, The Last Revelation, was the game in the Tomb Raider early series that had a game of Senet inside. This was actually quite old, from 1999. So this is a screenshot from the game. I didn't really want to show you a gameplay video because it's a very long video. Now, in the game, you are going underground into the tombs of Egyptians and various other kinds of artifacts, areas where there are artifacts, and one of them is this one where Lara actually ends up in this area and she has this Senet game in front of her. So you can see this is like a modified Senet board. Okay, so this is what Lara would see, or you as the player playing Lara. So it's not exactly looking like the real Senet. It has a little bit of variation in the shape, but generally that's the goal, right? You want to start and then you want to move away from the board following the, if you can see here, so different players, you start, whether you're red side, you move to the end, or blue side, you move to the end. Now, legend has it, or rather if you look at Reddit streamers or gamers who talk about this on Reddit, this Senet game was super hard for people who played Tomb Raider. And for some people, they couldn't get past this level because they couldn't kind of like beat the Senet game. And that was interesting because it made people really angry. But it also told you that it's not a simple game, because the point of the game is saying it's not that simple to get to life after death or the afterlife. So this was seen as a period of games where the game is not trying to make things easy for you. So if you cannot get past this level, too bad, Lara. You're going to have to stay there until you finish this Senet game. Then only you can proceed to the next level. Maybe in modern games, people could like skip or get hints, right? So older games tend to be a little bit more brutal, more challenging, less chance for the player to get tips from the computer or the AI. So that's a good example of a modern game giving respect and giving some kind of acknowledgement of a game that came from the past, especially as it relates to the culture of what Lara Croft was doing, going into Egyptian culture. So it makes sense to use something from the Senet. Then I'm going to move on. So that was Egypt. And you will see a lot of the earlier ancient games are actually not from the West. Okay, so Egypt is not a Western country, it's more towards the Middle Eastern area, so we're still relatively in the East. Then we're talking about Go. This is the Chinese version of Go. There are a few other versions which I'll talk about briefly. But essentially, if Senet is about 5,000 plus, then the Chinese Go game is estimated roughly 3,000 to 4,000, although nobody is very precise about the actual date it began. So you can see the board that is in this image is not a Go board. Okay, this is not the correct board, but it gives you, and I just wanted to let you see roughly how people in ancient times might have possibly played it, where they're basically seeing it as a pastime. You know, they have more free time, they're chilling, eating something, drinking tea, and playing a game. So how does the Go game work? For those of you, anybody has played this game before? Yes? No? Anyone?
No.
Oh, no one at all? Okay.
Take too much brain.
Take too much brain. Okay. So I mean, it's still a very popular game in China. So I don't know if some of our Chinese classmates have played it before. It's too simple, or rather, it looks like it's very simple.
Oh.
Now you know the game. So now you start to see familiar. So some of you probably might have played it. And I think a couple of years ago, one of your seniors, the group, when they were creating their board game, they created a game that is a little bit similar to Go, although it doesn't look like this, but the concept is the same. So if you look at the Go board, for me, I find it to be a really beautiful minimalist board. Minimalist meaning you don't have very complex pieces, basically just two colors. The shape is pretty much the same. And apparently in ancient times, you don't even need to have the pieces crafted so nicely. You can just have pieces of flat stone and a kind of dark piece of stone and a whitish piece of stone, and then you can kind of play it. Of course, you need to collect quite a lot of stones. But it's a simple grid, okay, and it's 19 by 19, the grid. And essentially what makes it a little bit different from some of the Western type games is you are not putting your piece in the square, you're putting it on the line, right? You can see there. And the objective of Go is pretty simple. It's basically a game where it's strategy to take over space. Alright, so if you can take over more space with your little pieces or chips there, then essentially you have the mastery over the space of the Go board. Now let me just show you a little bit more. Now the reason why some of you say too much brain is actually pretty true, because the concept of Go as a game we might think is for fun, but it's really a huge big deal, especially in this part of the world, in Asia. And you can see there I gave you a date, March 2016. Now, so that was an important date because for many years all the Go players and the professionals, the high ranking Go players, they all came from Asia. Maybe you have players also from the West, but they could not actually beat any of the Asian players. And the Asian players are not all from China. Quite a few of them are from other Asian countries. So for a long time, the reigning champion was this guy from Korea, Lee Sedol. As you see there, he is on the right. And I'm not really sure of the ranking system, but apparently this 9 Dan is a highest ranking position. So if you're a professional Go player, you just like professional chess player, you go around and you beat other players. So what did the Western people do? Well, specifically Google, they wanted to beat an Asian player, but they didn't have a human from the West who could do it. So they built a computer. And the computer they built is this computer called AlphaGo, which spent years figuring out how to beat a human player. Now, the interesting thing about Go is, according to game history, it's the only game with the most number of possible moves. I cannot remember the number. It's one crazy infinite number, like one, I don't know, like millions or billions of possible moves, far greater than chess. And that is why it took AlphaGo years to come up with all possible scenarios to be able to win. So a lot of people say this is cheating. Obviously a computer can do something a human can't do, but eventually, unfortunately, AlphaGo did beat Lee Sedol. 2016, I think they played something like they played a few rounds of matches, and the end, after a calculation of all the scores of each match, AlphaGo eventually beat Lee Sedol. And okay, this is a video. Now what I'm just going to show you down here later when I post, I'm not going to be able to show the video. It's very long, but there's a documentary about how they built AlphaGo and how AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol. So I gave you the link there. The full documentary is available online. If we ever have time this semester, I might show it to you. I think in the past, I did show the entire documentary to game students, and it kind of made everybody pay like great attention because it was very emotional. A very emotional kind of documentary, because when Lee Sedol lost to the computer, he was very emotional, like crying. And it was a very sad moment for us when we saw it, because we want our computers to be strong and to be fast and to be great. But it was a moment when you realize, humans, we have lost. We are never going to beat this computer. And Lee Sedol retired from professional Go playing about 3 years later, and he retired and he said he can never beat a computer. Partly that's why he retired. And he said that it's impossible for humans to beat a computer. And you can sense he was basically saying, you know, that shouldn't be the case, because we built the computer. By the end, it supersedes us, or it's more superior to us. So that was kind of like a crushing moment for humanity, because a lot of times people saw the computer as not creative enough to come up with moves that only a human could. But now you have a computer who could do it. And the weird and sad part is, for Asians, it's seen as a Western computer because it's built by Western people, so to speak. And later on, what AlphaGo did, Google's computer, is it kept beating other Go players. In a way, it's kind of like trying to have world domination. And here is when I want to show you this video to let you see that games is not just about playing, it's very political. and it's about how nations see themselves in relation to other countries when you're fighting each other. And this is not even human versus human, it's human versus computer. So this is a short clip where you can just see how it works. You can kind of see there how politics plays a huge role in how we think about games and also how countries think about games. And more specifically, I think if you look at that little clip just now, is China's strategy is block the match, don't let people see. But the reality is, as some of our Chinese classmates know, you get around it using VPN. And more importantly, even if you didn't see the match, you get the news of it, right? So it's kind of impossible to totally shut out some of the news of how the computer is doing better than a human. But the thing I want to talk about at a slightly deeper level is if you look at this Go board. Okay, I'm going to go back to this more beautiful version. So if you look at the Go board, what is the strategy? It's basically to take over space. And here's when I'm going to explain to you the aesthetic, like the art reasons why certain things look the way they do for this board. Remember, I said it's very minimal. You're not trying to make any piece look different. They just look exactly the same, except you have black color, you have white color, and there's no differentiation between the pieces in terms of shape. So if you think about it, it's very similar to a kind of philosophy of, if you think about Chinese communism, or think about how Chinese people think about China, it's basically a lot of people, everybody is more or less the same, we are all living in the same space, but in the history of China is a history of trying to negotiate spaces around the Chinese region, right? So thinking about how to deal with other countries on the neighboring or borders of China. So we're talking about places like Mongolia or Tibet. So the legend has it that when China and Tibet had some kind of conflict and China wanted to take over Tibet or dominate Tibet, take over the space of the Tibetan country, the legend has it that the ruler of Tibet did not want to fight because they were Buddhists and they were anti-violence. And basically they told the Chinese military, we want to fight with a Go game. If we can win, you don't take over our land. If you win, you will take over our land. Fair enough. So they played the Go game, and the legend has it that China lost. So Tibet remained. So this is a good way to think about this game. To me, is a perfect symbol of how Chinese culture thinks about space. Is mostly to think about space, territory, and domination, and also negotiation. You negotiate with another person. You strategize how to take over a space. Nobody is different. Everybody is the same. It's just that different color than you to show that they are not you. But the goal is space domination or territorial expansion. Because a lot of what China does today in modern times, which I find very fascinating, the Chinese do not go into a country, fight a war, dominate people militarily. Okay, they may do it internally within China borders, different areas, they're not happy with certain groups of people. But in terms of how China deals with the rest of the world, a lot of it is negotiation through trade, through assistance, how they help Malaysia to do certain things, then Malaysia help them to do certain things. So it's more like diplomatic relations, which to me is the beautiful symbol of what the Go board looks like. Everybody is equal. We are just carefully, slowly negotiating our way to find out who is more dominant and who wins. And essentially, the game of Go is a slow and rather polite game. You're not trying to kick someone or fight with someone in a very violent way. It's very strategic. So that's how I see, for me, the game of Go in terms of how it relates to Chinese culture. And of course, here you can see the political aspect when you talk about the computer. And if you remember just now in the clip, how does the computer play the game? The computer, of course, cannot move the pieces. So you have the human, who is basically like the hand of the computer. The computer will tell the human, and the human will make the move as what the computer wants. Okay, so I already spoke about this. How does Go reflect some of Chinese culture? And later I'm going to talk about another game which is a totally different way of thinking about power and domination, which is different from how the Go game looks at it. But before I talk about the other games, so there are other variations of Go. And one game in particular that I've played, a very cute and beautiful game by a very small development team of 3 people coming out of, I believe, Poland. And this is a game called Machinarium by Amanita Design. You can see their name there in the bottom. And in this Machinarium game, it's a pretty sort of, I won't say it's that difficult, but there are moments in the game where you have to get through certain levels, and the levels are not easy to get through. So one of these levels is you're going to have to play this game called Gomoku. Now if you look at this image here, it's not really like Go because the chips or the pieces are in the square, they're not on the line. So it's kind of like a Western variation, because I don't think a lot of Western games are on lines. They tend to like to be in the square. So it's kind of a Western adaptation. But Gomoku actually is a Japanese variant or variation of the Chinese Go game. So originally the word Gomoku is Japanese, and Go in Japan or in Japanese is 5. Okay, so this is a Go game reduced to 5 pieces. So this particular game in this Machinarium, so you are playing a robot, that's you over there, and you move through different levels. So in this particular level, he's moving through this space here, you can see. And these fellas over here, I mean, they are playing a card game. I don't remember much about this card game because I remember it was like easy. Then he encounters this guy here, and this table here, if you click on this table in the game, boom, you get this Gomoku. Okay, now this Gomoku was very tough. I had like, it took me like a few days to beat this game, because of course you're playing against this robot which is like the AI of the game, and your goal is very simple. It's basically to come up with 5 of your pieces lined up together. So once you get those 5 pieces lined up together, you will win. And it's a little bit like Connect 4 or Connect 5, which is a Western variation, which I'm not going to talk about now, but I'll mention later. So just kind of remember this game, Gomoku. And it is Machinarium creators a little bit of like respect to both Gomoku, the Japanese game, and also Go, because Gomoku is a Go game where they use the pieces from Go to play it, but in a smaller, faster game. So this is from Machinarium, and these developers are not even Chinese or Asian, right? So they're from Poland. I think it's Poland or Czechoslovakia, one of those countries. And it's a kind of game that also goes back to the Lara Croft era, whereby you cannot advance unless you beat an old school game. So this little robot here, if he cannot win this game, then he cannot go to this group of robots, and then when he's finished, he can exit through this door here. So you're kind of stuck. Okay, moving on. So I'm going to move to the next game, and I'm going to just ask all of you, look at these pieces. What game do you think this is based on 4 of the pieces of this game? I'm not showing you all the pieces, just show you 4. What game could it possibly be, you think? Any guesses? Chess?
Chess.
Anybody else? Okay, no. Now,
I also think it's chess.
chess. Okay, what makes it chess? What makes you feel like or think it's chess?
The pieces kind of look different.
Kind of look different from what?
And size. The king should be bigger size.
Okay, very good. So you already straight away got to the core, right? Which is pieces don't look alike. You have some kind of like a, how to say, visually they already have hierarchy or levels or position. Very good. So these, you're on point, everybody who answered. So these are ancient chess pieces from 11th century. They are made from ivory, which is basically the elephant's tusk. All right. And you can kind of see they obviously look very different from modern chess pieces. And this are probably partially also how people had limited tools to make some of the things that we can see today in a normal chessboard. So if you look at a normal chessboard today, that's what you will see down there. Okay, and for those of you who don't play it much or don't know much about it, these are basically the various pieces, or okay, I'm just going to call them like characters, if you want to call them characters, because they all have some kind of like role with limited rules surrounding their roles. So you have the queen, king, bishop, knight, rook, and pawn. And the estimate of chess is roughly about 1,500. So it's a lot younger than Go game or Senet game as well. But if you think about it, look at the board. So the differences with Go, very simple. You are in the square, you're not on the line. But remember what I said earlier about Go. Everybody is equal. All pieces are the same, just differentiated by color. Here you have color differentiation, but the pieces are not all the same. The pieces that look the most the same, where you have a lot of them, are these pieces, the pawns. Okay, they are seen as the lowest level, kind of like the soldiers, I guess. And it's funny their name is pawn, because in English language, the word pawn also signifies like you are a victim of someone using you, right? People are taking advantage or using you. You are a pawn of someone else more powerful. So it's not exactly a nice term you want to call someone, to call them a pawn. And if you look at the chess board, look at the sides, very clear. I'm on this side, you on that side. I'm gonna come over, take over your people from your side, you're gonna come over and take people from my side. Whereas Go, everybody is everywhere. Right? So this is what I mean when I say the way the Chinese strategize spatial or territorial domination is very unclear, because spaces change all the time. You're basically negotiating spatial domination slowly and over many moves. Now chess, everybody has a limited role or limited move that they can make, and everybody has a clear space, like you there, I'm here. So you can argue it kind of is a mindset as well of how you think about fighting or how you think about territorial expansion or domination. Now to know more about chess, I'm going to show you a short documentary. Now this is a very nice documentary because all the top or some of the top chess players in the world are in this documentary, and they are talking about the game they love. And this is not too long either.
I understand, as any history, it has been surrounded by many myths.
In the beginning, in India, about 13 centuries ago, chess was played by 4 opponents with dice. It was called Chaturanga.
Chess was born in India and then traveled westwards to Persia, and then through Arab countries to the Iberian Peninsula in what was Spain at that time.
The myths all go to a game being invented by a person. In fact, what almost certainly happened was chess being invented over a century's time, maybe 2 centuries' time, by a series of people, most of whom didn't know one another, merchants on the Silk Road, traveling back and forth, a lot of time on their hands.
What we know for sure that in the 16th and 17th century, chess through Spain and entered Europe and was played at some European courts. And at that time, the game was dominated by Spanish and Italian players. They made the first major contribution to the game of chess and created mostly the rules and the first ideas how to handle the game of chess.
The easiest way to look at chess, it's a war. There are 2 armies fighting each other. It's a game of intimidation.
Psychological warfare.
You have the king. You have the king's chief of staff, now known as the queen.
Originally, in India, Persia, and Arabia, she was male and weak. But she changed sex in Europe in the Middle Ages.
The queen is the most powerful and the most valuable piece on the chessboard.
You've got the pawns, the little people who are getting sacrificed early on. Then you go beyond that and you see, no, it's not just about war. This is actually a game of power relationships between players on each side.
I fear the queen is powerless now. queen is never powerless. For example.
And then you go beyond that and you see, no, this is actually a game of space. It's actually a game of geometry. You have all these different squares, you have all these different routes that people can take.
And then trying to give up this pawn, so if the white pawn captures it, then the black bishop would be free to retreat.
Then you go beyond that and you say, no, this is actually a game of trying to anticipate what the other player is going to do, or in fact, what you would do in reaction to all these possible moves on the other side. Chess is more than anything a game of will to win, a game of need to win.
There were all different types of chess players. You know, there were artists and sportsmen and competitors and fighters and gamblers and whatever.
You are putting yourself in a world that is infinite. It's abstract. You are, in essence, reshaping your mind.
Queen.
The total number of unique possible chess games, considering all the different possible moves and how long all chess games could go on, and it is 10 to the 120th power, or 1,000 trillion, 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 trillion games.
That's why it's probably the only game which had survived centuries and still is very much alive.
You can spend your whole life, do nothing else but study the game, and you are not going to touch even a sliver of chess's magnificent, almost infinite potential.
Okay, so you can kind of see there, interestingly, how each game wants to assert its dominance and say things like, you know, this is the oldest game, or this is the game that has survived the most. So that's what Garry Kasparov was saying at the end in relation to chess. And also how, if you look at some of the players just now who were interviewed, they're talking about chess as like a, you know, it's like the oldest game, it's the greatest game because it has survived. But it's funny because at the end of the day, the Chinese Go game is a much older game. Now, I don't consider Egyptian Senet in the same category as chess and Go, for the simple reason that people don't really play Egyptian Senet anymore. It's not the kind of game that has world tournaments and things like that. But Go game definitely still have tournaments and competition globally, and chess as well. But for some weird reason, chess entered the West, and therefore it became a big thing. And if you also look at, if you remember the video, they showed early chessboard during the Indian era when it was first discovered or first created in India. It looks quite different from the chessboard that you see today, which I'm showing you here, because all these so-called characters or pieces, if you look at their role or look at their title, queen, king, bishop, knight, rook, pawn, they are all largely Western cultural symbols. Okay, now I'm not saying in Asia you don't have king and queen, but the very Western aspect of it for me would be this too. You have bishop. Now what is a bishop? Anybody know? I don't mean in terms of chess, I mean the word bishop. Who is a bishop?
Advisor.
Advisor. Anybody else?
Brain.
Huh? Sorry, a what? A brain? Okay, so basically everybody thinks it's an advisor, but actually if you look at specifically Western history, bishop is a religious leader in the church, the Christian church. Okay, so bishop is not a very high-ranking religious leader in the Christian church. You have the bishop, and then above the bishop you have the archbishop, and then above the archbishop finally you have the pope. The pope is one guy. So bishop essentially is a religious leader advisor. which is very interesting to me because in that whole group of 6 here, bishop is the religious, king, queen is the ruler, knight, of course, the fighter, rook, basically if you look at the shape, although I never really understood the word rook, but the shape is like castle, right? It's the fortress if you think about the Western style of architecture, and the pawn, of course, the soldier. So the knight is basically like a higher ranking soldier guarding the castle, and the soldiers, the low level soldiers, are the pawns. But the bishop is a very interesting character because it's the one character that makes chess very religious and very Christian. Because India doesn't have Christianities at that time, so why would it have a bishop? And India don't have king and queen, they have like, you know, Raja and Maharaja and things like that. So how did it move? How did chess adapt and change? It had to do a lot of changes and adaptation when it moved to Europe to be able to be accepted by the Europeans and the Western players. And if you remember the video, the lady, the female chess champion, she said queen became dominant because when the chessboard moved to Europe, who were the leaders in Europe at the time? You have like Queen Elizabeth, Queen Victoria, they are all women. So it makes sense that your chessboard should have the most powerful person or most powerful piece be queen and not king, right? So that's the funny thing about a country like, let's say, England. The king actually has no real kind of like significance other than he's the husband of the queen. So that's how you kind of see chess evolves, and also how politics works, because all the chess player, they talk about chess like it's like the best game ever, but no mention of the fact that chess actually is second to Go in terms of age, in terms of kind of like domination over the years. And unlike Go, chess changed a lot when it moved from country to country and traveled. It changed the pieces, it changed the names, it changed some of the rules even, right? So the rules that we inherit today are largely from European kind of thinking, whereas Go has not changed for the last 3,000 to 4,000 years. So for me, the Go game would be the most authentic, meaning it never really changed, it stayed the way it is. And maybe that's also because it didn't leave Asia, it didn't go to the West or become big in the West. And so what makes chess what it is also about roles and about class, right? At the end, you have a richer, dominant class, the king and queen, and then slightly lower bishop, then slightly lower knight, etc., etc. So you have different levels, different class, and that's a lot of Europe. If you look at Europe in the last, you know, few thousand plus years, it's all about class. Who is the king? Who is the queen? Who are the low-level people? Now you might say, well, does that mean China doesn't have class? Of course, China has class too. If you're talking about imperial China, you obviously have the emperors, and then you have the people below him, and then you have the advisors, military advisors, and then you have the high-ranking military people. You have lots of class, different class levels of people, and then the very poor, and then the soldiers, etc. But what makes Go very fascinating to me is the game does not reflect that class. The game shows a kind of ideal equality where everybody looks the same, all the pieces are the same. Chess, not true. Chess really shows the class. It's visibly about different classes of pieces within the board, right? So this is what I mean. What is the game telling about the story of that culture? Is actually telling us something if we really analyze a little bit deeper. So I'm going to move on now. So again, what do games tell you about the culture that it's from? And when you are creating a game, ask yourself this question as well. You know, how does the game you make reflect your own culture? And I'm going to say something here which maybe not everybody will agree with me. I think a lot of times why Malaysians, we have not yet created a game that is really groundbreaking, is I think a lot of times Malaysians, we don't know what's our culture. We don't have a clear sense of what is our culture, and we don't really even look to our culture for inspiration. So we tend to copy and take a lot of ideas from other cultures. I'm not saying that's bad, but I'm saying it does make our game sometimes like lacking in some Malaysian element. So moving on. Now back to this Mesoamerican ball game. Now some of you say it's very old, and I agree, it is very old. So now I'm going to do a shift. We're moving towards less board-based games, which is the last 3 games are more board-based, and now we are moving to physical sports, which is also a form of a game, but more using your body rather than using pieces. Now it is old, probably not as old as Go, but it's up there and it's definitely older than chess, and Senet still gets the prize for being the top oldest game. This ball game, for those of you who have heard of it, is a very famous game because of some of the rituals surrounding it. So here's when I'm going to talk about the combination of sports and ritual. So you do certain activity to make the sports game have meaning, not just to play the sport, but there's some meaning that will give cultural symbol or cultural significance for the people. So this is a picture or an image, all right, from National Geographic, and of course it's just a representation of what this ball game might have looked like. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it in relation to images that we have seen from obviously excavation or archaeological excavations, where people dug up ruins from certain parts of the world and then they found things, and that's really how we understand or learn about our ancient history, through all these objects that we find, including, like yesterday I talked about the caves in France. We found the caves, then it allowed us to tell the story of humanity using those objects. So if we didn't find the objects, it's very hard to tell the story. So from this particular image you can see you have 2 gods there. So this guy here and this guy here are supposed to be gods within the Mayan mythology, and this here is actually the ball. What are they doing? Obviously they're playing with the ball. It's not really soccer. I'll show you how the game works. And they are above ground, so this is kind of like earth, and underneath them is the underworld. Very similar to Christian mythology as well, right? To think of hell as below. Satan, hell, fire is within or underneath us. Remember yesterday I talked about how early ancient humans tried to make sense of their world when they didn't have the ability of science or mathematics, and one of the key elements humans always focus on is how did that ball of fire, the sun, get up there in the sky, and what is that other ball of fire at night, the moon, how do they all interrelate? So the Mayans are a great example of a people who created this myth of these 2 players who played the ball game, and how, if you remember just now that video, at the end one is the sun and one is the moon. So that's an interesting creative story about something that we know now is just planets or shapes in the space, which is the sun and the moon. But the fascinating thing to me, if you were paying attention, is this is a ball game of death, right? So if you lose, you get beheaded. Your head will be cut off and used in a sacrifice to the gods. I guess you could say is the ultimate bizarre idea of losing really is so worthless. You are a loser, you don't or shouldn't live anymore. You should just give yourself as a sacrifice, because sacrifice is considered a very honorable thing to do. So if you lose, to retain your honor, allow yourself to get your head chopped off and to be given as sacrifice. So in a weird way, I mean, if you think about it in modern times, of course we think it's like crazy and barbaric. I mean, imagine if Lee Chong-wei didn't win the match, a badminton match, right? And then at the end he came back to Malaysia and then we had to chop off his head and use him as sacrifice. I mean, that would be like insane. I mean, we can't imagine that, but that was a different time where the way people saw humans, gods, and the world very different from today. And to my knowledge, no game has really looked very deeply into this myth, although there have been games that try to get inspiration from some of the visuals that you see. So I'm going to show you some of these games. And also I'm including this slide for later if you want to check it out. Basically, it's talking about the story that the guy was relating in the video, right? About these 2 brothers. they're twins playing ball, and then they played so loudly it made the Lord of Death. Actually, it's not just one lord, there are many gods of death and underworld gods who were very upset, didn't like them to be so noisy and caused a lot of kind of disruption to their peacefulness in the underworld. And so at the end of the day, he got them to do a lot of he managed to get them to play a game with the end result being if they lose, they also lose their head. So you see one of the brothers lose their head. So this is a comic that was an adaptation of that story. Y'all can check it out later. And for me, the most amazing thing about this myth is so game. There are so many game possibilities, although not really explored yet by anyone. So if you look at how this world is constructed, so remember he said that they went into the underworld, okay, and the underworld is called Xibalba, and the underworld has many stages. So these are the drawings of the two twins, and in order for them to emerge out of this underworld, they have to go through all these 6 stages. And so this was a kind of a, how to say, like a game, but not a digital game, that was essentially constructed to think about these 6 spaces as 6 levels. Very similar to a lot of games, you know, you move through different levels and then you meet the end boss, that kind of stuff. So to me, it's very ripe for use in a typical kind of game environment, exploration, action, adventure kind of thing. So far, nobody has done it yet. And I'm just going to show you a clip of modern day revival. So this ball game has not died. There are current people living in Mexico. The Mayans are from the area of Mexico, the country now. And you can see them reviving this game. You can see a little bit of how hard the game is. I won't show you the whole video, I'll just show you a little, because I'm not going to show the entire video. But if you notice, they are not, even though some of them said they are trying to follow the tradition, actually if you go back to how the game was originally played, they are not exactly following with great accuracy the tradition. First thing, the female player, she said the original tradition is there's gender duality, men and women, but if you look at some of the writings and historical documents about the original Mayan game, it's all male, only men played the game. So women were not part of playing the game, and it's only men that were sacrificed, obviously not women. So that is not really true that there were men and women playing the game. Maybe men and women played the game for fun, we don't know about that, but certainly in the ritual competition you don't have women playing it. So that's interesting how people are reinterpreting the tradition, which makes sense, right? Because we also want gender equality today, so we don't want only guys to be playing it. All over the world, a lot of sports, if not most sports, are played by both men and women. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, if you go back to the image from here, you remember this ring in the first video, which is from the Smithsonian, right? It's a historical channel. You will see that this ring is the objective. The original Mayan ball game, they have to get the ball through that hole in order to win. But in the modern game, notice there's no more ring anymore. If you remember, the guy said the objective is just to push the ball to force the other team to another space, to get out of their space. So it's a little bit more spatial and territorial, and the concept of putting the ball through this hole is gone. But to me, the big question in terms of gameplay, if you want to really analyze it, the big mystery which I haven't solved, I tried to look for it but I really couldn't find, it's really not a lot of info, is how is it possible for the Mayan players way back in ancient times, how is it possible for them to put the ball through this hole? Right? If you remember from the video shows you the place. Let me try to show you.
In the pot, the plays side by side.
Oh, right. Okay, now I can't find it now. But if you remember in the video, they showed the space where you have the court where the ball game is being played. Now this particular hole is really high, very, very high. How in the world can you get the ball so high if you cannot touch the ball with your hand? You only bouncing the ball with your body, your hips and your shoulders. Is actually like super hard. So some of the myth around the ball game is ball game players from ancient Mayan times, they started playing in the morning and they played until there's no more sunlight because nobody could get the ball through that hole. So there's another thing that's going on, right? Is also endurance. So this is ultimately a sport to show strength, bravery, courage, and lastly, willingness to die. And this is what I would say is the cultural significance of, to me, this particular game in relation to the other games. If you think about Go, if you think about Senet, if you think about chess, none of them involve human sacrifice. And in a way, you can say this sort of game also shows that in this world, in the Mayan world, human life actually is not as worthy as gods. So if you die and sacrifice to the gods, it's worthy. Then that's a great way to go. Similar in a little bit to the Egyptians, the belief that our life today means nothing much. You want to be afterlife. You want to move to a different existence. So in that way, Egyptians and Mayans quite similar in their concern and value placed on life after death. And I guess I'm going to ask you to also reflect a little bit in your own world. Those of you who have a religion or you have a cultural background, how important is today's life or life on earth? Or is it more important to think about life after death? Right? If you don't have a concept of life after death, then what is life on earth? Where do you get meaning from? If life on earth suck, do you have an option? Christians and Muslims will say, of course you have an option. You die lah. When you die, then life will get better. Of course, you must do good first. If you do good, then when you die, you go to heaven. But what about all others who don't believe in that? Right? So something worth thinking about, because we have changed a lot over the years. And there is a game. I think some of you know I played. I mentioned it in the first class. This game sort of indirectly respects and goes back to a little bit of mentioning of the Mayan concept of the underworld. Not very in detail, but I'll just show you a little clip from it. Okay, so how does the game really work? It's basically saying you are a human and you enter this world where everybody in there who is powerful and who runs the entire world are pigs, and your job is basically to go in there and build your house and survive in this pig land. But more importantly, you also go underground. As you can see in the picture there, you have some caves, if you remember. So some of these caves are designed to look very kind of Brazil, not Brazil, what do you call it? Ecuadorian, meaning looking at the equator, countries on the equator, including Mexico. So you have caves, you have a lot of rainforests, you have jungle, you have a lot of those plants and also flora and fauna that is commonly associated with the rainforest. Then of course they have those kind of predators, like the mobs as they call it, scorpions, bats that will try to attack you. And you go through the caves, different levels of caves, in a kind of a darkness that is similar to the underworld. And look at how you move. So to progress through the game, you actually have a map which generates as you move. Right? So if I just use my pointer, you may not, where do you start? I forgot. Yeah, I think you start here, which is basically the opening from the top, and as you move, you open up more and more as you go. So when you move through here, you open up, you have to like break through some of the stones to open up, and then at the end you end up with a pretty big maze or labyrinth, and you're trying to escape to get here, where you escape through a different place and you meet some bosses along the way. So this has a little bit of the idea of moving through different levels of the underworld, except there are no real bosses in every single of these little squares here. Okay, although you do encounter little irritations like scorpions and bats and things, and you can die obviously because they are quite powerful. Alright, moving on. So from the earlier Mayan game, where you know it's all about strength, bravery, endurance, it makes sense that we would then move to the other great sporting event around the same time as the Mayan ball game, probably about about 500 years difference, is the Olympic Games. And I'm just showing you how the original Olympic Games had what type of events. If you look at the list here, can you tell me which event is definitely not in today's Olympics?
Equestrian.
Okay, definitely. Very good. So you don't have this chariot horse race anymore. Anything else? This also depends how well you know the today's Olympics.
Creation.
Which one again? This one?
Creation. Huh?
Which one?
This one, yeah.
This one, right? The Pancration. Alright, so this is also absolutely correct. Also not available anymore, and I'll tell you a little bit why. So these two up here, do we still have the javelin today? Yeah, we do. We still have the long jump. All of this we have, except of course running event, nobody's carrying a shield or wearing the headgear, so that obviously looks a little bit different. No carrying armor and all that. We still have running, but pretty armorless. And discus, do we have discus, or we have something that I think it looks like a discus, but it's not exactly a disc if I'm not mistaken. The original discus, which is this object here, the original one, if you see, it says made of iron, lead and bronze. Definitely I don't think we have that made of this material. I could be wrong. I think we have something called the shot put, which is a round object. Okay, I'm not too sure. Those who can, if you're able to just search it, just let me know later. So you can see the original Olympics games quite different, and obviously every game reflects the culture or reflects what was going on at the time. So what's the history of the Olympic Games? Why is it called the Olympic Games? You can see here, very simple. Olympic Games began in Olympia. That's why the name is obviously Olympic. But what made this game popular? Very simple. Oh, I'll talk about this later. Very simple. Greek society. This is a game in Greece. Greek society at that time was essentially made up of cities, different cities within Greece, and these cities all are independent, meaning they have their own rulers or their own administration. And Greece was known as a warring nation, or they were not really a country. They are basically a region with many cities. At that time you didn't really have a concept of like nation or country. All these cities were fighting like all the time. Alright, so you have famous peoples like Spartans, or from Sparta, from the city of Sparta. They are seen as the most brave, the most heroic, can fight like crazy. And then you have Athenians from Athens, who can fight but not as great as Spartans. So essentially they were fighting all the time. They were constantly at war, constantly killing each other, trying to level up. And of course they had also intelligent people who didn't fight, who were doing all the thinking, but they were not the military. What this caused is, if you have a area of the world where everybody is fighting all the time, what's going to happen? You're going to be very tired. War is going to be making you tired mentally, physically. You need time to rest. Before you can rest, you already have another war. And Greece is not as large as, let's say, China. China had a lot of wars as well over its, you know, thousands of years of history, but Chinese people were vast, so you could always have more Chinese people come in and be the pawn or soldiers to fight. Greece not that big, so if everybody is fighting and many are dying, how are you gonna kind of rest or rejuvenate? Eventually you have no people left if everybody is fighting and dying. Whoever it is that invented Olympic Games designed the games to be a moment to rest. That's why Olympic Games was held every 4 years, and now we hold it every 4 years as a respect. But olden days, why was it every 4 years? Because it took that amount of time to tell everybody, hey, the games is happening, okay? So during this period, don't fight. Get together. We will get together and have some sporting event competition. We won't kill each other. We will just like chill, have fun, have sporting competition. After it's all over, we very chill, then we go back to fight for real. It took many years to go around the cities because they are far apart. Traveling, you didn't have obviously high-speed train or cars, so you have to travel to tell all these little pockets of places in Greece, to tell the people when is the event, what is the date, and they have to plan in advance so that they can travel all over Greece to tell people this is the date, right? So it took a lot of time. And even today in modern times, when you have Olympics, you have the symbol. If you remember or you know anything about it, a person, an athlete will light the fire from the last Olympic Games, and he will take that fire or the torch and run and pass the torch to many athletes all over the world until they reach the new Olympic Games site in a different part of the world. So it takes years, or I don't know whether it really takes that long, but not 4 years, I don't think. But it does take time, and it's trying to simulate what the Olympians or what the Greeks did way back then. I'm going to just talk a little bit about Pankration because it's, to me, I understand why we don't have it anymore, but I also find it like really ridiculously fascinating that they had this particular sporting event. So Pankration, the word in Greek, basically means all power. Now modern day historians basically saying, you know, it has a combination of wrestling and boxing. So this is an artistic sculpture of what people did when they played this or when they competed in Pankrations. But what made it really brutal is it's an anything goes match. Alright, so down here you can read it yourself if you want. Anything goes meaning you can do anything to the opponent just as long as you win. So what does anything mean? Literally, I can poke your eyes out. I can take my finger and poke your eyes out and blind you during the match so that you will be, you know, you will have difficulty fighting. And a lot of times Pankration, according to legend, is fight till death. You will only be able to win if your opponent says, enough, I give up, I concede the fight to you, or your opponent dies. Essentially, there is no either or, right? So you are so good until the person can't take it anymore. But so good doesn't mean skill. So good can be also brutality. So imagine you're fighting in this Pankration and you take your fingers and you pull out all your two eyes of your opponents. Your opponent's bleeding, can't see shit. He has no eyes anymore, but he still don't want to lose because it's dishonorable to lose. So he will still fight you, but he can't take your eyes out because he can't see. So what can he do? He can punch you in the balls, he can bite you, he can do whatever he wants because the objective is actually winning at all costs. So this is, for me, like the brutality of it. I'm shocked that no game has tried to explore this since, you know, there are lots of gamers who like those brutal hardcore shit. So to me, it's one of those interesting kinds of parts of history in Greece. And as I mentioned before, these are the functions. You take, number 2 is the one I mentioned, your truce, a truce meaning a halt in fighting from the war for 3 months. So the sporting event, the Olympics, took about 3 months, and all the athletes who came to fight, who came to compete, not fight, who came to compete in these 3 months, they cannot bring weapons, and that was the rule. So you knew that they are not using the Olympics to fight among themselves and, you know, kill their enemy. And this is another interesting thing, right? The original Olympics, if you look at the images, all the Olympians are male and they're naked. They don't wear any clothes. Now, if you look at some old images of Olympic Games, all the artistic representation, they are all naked all the time. And of course, some people laugh and say, okay, cannot be this nonsense, what nudity and all that, why are they like, you know, some kind of like perverted people, why they're all naked? Well, it makes sense because they are so warrior-like and they love to fight. If they have any clothes at all, there was a fear they can hide weapons in their clothing. So when they're completely naked, you can't hide nothing. I mean, you can try to hide something in your, you know, anus or something, but I don't think it'll be very effective. So as a result, the nudity is functional to prevent hiding of weapons. That's an interesting bit of trivia there. And the mythical reason for Olympics, number one, would be they see it as a way to give tribute to the gods, the Greek gods, because the belief is humans fight because Greek gods also fight. So we are just doing what the gods are doing. We are celebrating the gods in our own fights. And the Olympics is to celebrate some of the victories of these battles of the gods. And the last one, number 3, which is most interesting, is Greeks believe you cannot be an educated citizen if your body and your spirit is not physically fit and mentally competitive. I don't think this is an important part of education in our contemporary world anymore. Right? Imagine if SPM you have a subject, physical education. If you don't pass that subject for your SPM or O levels or A levels, you cannot pass your entire secondary school. It will be crazy, right? Lots of people will have to be fit in order to be able to get a basic certificate to leave school. So those are the kinds of things that were unique about Greek education, which is also why people saw the Greeks and viewed them with great amount of respect and also awe and idealism. So that was an interesting aspect of how sports and war also related to Greeks and Greek education. And how do these Greek games, or what do these games reveal about their culture? Number one is about the body. The body is as important as the mind. And that to me was the fundamental aspect of Greek culture. They cared about not only how you think, but what you do with your body. And in a way, you can see that in a lot of games that look at Greek culture, you always have the very fit kind of heroic figure. Okay, and that's obviously for a reason. Now, moving on to Olympics today, we have things like games that reflect the Olympics. And the most popular one, I would say, over the years would be Mario and Sonic. They are going to be featured again in the Olympic Games for 2020. I do not know whether that Tokyo Games are going to happen or not because of the COVID situation. But let me just show you a little bit of the game. Alright, I'm not going to show you the whole thing. It's actually quite long. You can check it out yourself. Essentially, Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, this is not a new thing. Actually, the first time they were ever playing together in the Olympic Games was in 2007. And they were actually the first official video game of the Olympics in 2008 when the Olympic Games were in Beijing. So in a way, you could say that even as early as 2008, the Olympic Games Committee understood that video games is a part of the ecosystem of games and a way for young people to appreciate the Olympics or to see the Olympics in a fun way is to give them characters that they can relate to. And you can tell this is very geared towards kids. It is the officially licensed game, which means Olympic Committee will kind of like vet through and make sure that the games that are played by Mario and Sonic also appear in the Olympics, follow the rules exactly like the real Olympic Games. So it's quite authentic to the actual game. So they're not trying to like make some games that are different from the Olympics. The idea is to get people interested in the Olympics through playing a video game. And it's very popular because it has been around since 2007, as I said. And again, 2020 is again going to be the official video game. Together with, I think there's another, I think PlayStation is also having a human simulation type of Olympic Games. But at the end of the day, for me, Mario and Sonic, I don't know, they are kind of cooler and funner than just seeing humans simulation. Also, the only thing I wanted to mention about this is the first time you had a crossover between Nintendo and Sega working together in order to create these two characters playing at the games together. And in a way, it's also showing, you know, the spirit of cooperation and working together between two different game companies. Alright, moving along. This is the last ancient game I'm going to talk about. It's not as old as Mayan and Olympics, but it's pretty up there in terms of age. It's still in the thousands of years old. And why do I want to talk about sumo? Some of you might think it's not as globally recognized as Olympics, certainly. But what makes sumo interesting is I find that there are quite a lot of game developers who made games about sumo, a very funny type games. No surprise, because if you look at sumo, there are elements that will make people laugh. And it's a very kind of typical, stereotypical, okay, sumo wrestlers are big size, fat, so you make fun of fat people, which is not really a good thing to do, but for some reason, sumo elevates the visual of a fat person to a level that is almost kind of, you could say, heroic or legendary. So let me just start with a little bit of history about sumo. Now, sumo, as you all know, is a very old sport, as I show you here. And originally, the story goes, or the history goes, sumo wrestlers, way back in the 2000 plus years ago, sumo wrestlers originally were not fat. Who were originally sumo wrestlers? They were actually former samurai. So after the period where samurai were very there were a lot of samurai at a certain period in Japanese history, and then in a different period they were basically samurai without masters, right? Because the job of samurai were not really seen as that important after a specific period. I think it's the Edo period of Japanese history. And what happened is you have all these samurai without masters. They had no employers basically, or no boss to answer to, and the term for these kind of samurai is ronin. So you have all these ronin, very good skills, great fighters, no employer, no job. What are they doing? They're just roaming around Japan. And what do you have when you have great fighters, no job, probably drinking a lot, roaming around the country? When they find or see each other, they fight. They, get drunk, and then they kind of lose their temper. They say stupid shit, and then they start fighting. So, in a weird way, sumo started from these kind of fights. And at the end, I'm just going to fast forward many years later. Through all these fights, the government was like, how to make this fight not like a bad thing, because nobody wants to be arresting all these samurai, because samurai were were valued, were seen in like very awe, you know, they were great fighters. They're now all drunk, all fighting, all, you know, like falling down on the street, fighting each other. It's very disgraceful. Then the Japanese government came up with this idea, what if we create like an organized fight? Then people would come to watch, because, you know, who wouldn't want to watch samurais fighting? It will kind of elevate the fighting to a level which makes us feel proud of samurai, but also we can control it and it wouldn't be going out of hand and people getting drunk, and that would be bad for reputation of Japanese people. Essentially, that's the history of sumo in a nutshell. And why did they have to get bigger and bigger over time? I think it's also shows how sumo wrestlers were seen over time and the way the sport changed. Because at the beginning it was all just fighting, who will win the fight by any means necessary. And just like the pankration, which is very similar, sumo wrestlers early days can like gouge each other's eyes out, can like kick you in the balls, can pull your hair, can do all sort of crazy shit. Later, of course, they evolved the rules to not do some of this crazy shit, because it's seen as like, you know, disrespectful to Japanese culture, Japanese people, where you're supposed to be, you know, like more polite, more diplomatic, not do all these violent actions. Now, this particular image of the rope around the champion's waist, I'll talk about in a few minutes. It's important to remember the color coding. This particular type of match or competition, color is very important. So in sumo, the whiter your outfit, the higher ranking you are. So just now when you saw some of the fighters, they have the black kind of cloth around their crotch area. If it's black, that means they're very low ranking, and then the lighter the color, like blue, lighter green, then they're higher ranking. Of course, the highest will be if you have this white robe, or some of them you saw they're wearing like a kind of flesh colored or beige colored, so they will be kind of high ranking as well. So that's the color scheme. And when the lady said the sumo sport is about 1,000 years old, she's really looking at it in relation to sumo as we know it now, with the very big size fighters. But if you look at ancient sumo, as I told you, the fighters are not necessarily fat. I mean, they're actually quite skinny. And I'm going to show you a couple of games related to sumo. But what do these games reveal about the culture? I don't have time to talk about all the cultural elements in sumo, but I do want to tell you that the rope that you see around this guy's waist, essentially it looks like a traditional Shinto temple decoration. Okay, I totally don't have an image, I'm very sorry. But if you go to Japan, the prevalent or the dominant religion in Japan is Shintoism. And it is a belief or a religious belief whereby there is a respect for spirits, especially spirits in nature. Right? So the belief is there are spirits in nature, there's spirit in a tree, there's spirit in certain kinds of natural environment. And the idea behind the sumo wrestler is the sumo wrestler is a channel for the spirit. And the spirit in Japanese language is called kami, which some of you might have heard before. And you watch movies or animated films by the very famous Hayao Miyazaki. Now he has a lot of animated films about these spirits. If you've seen My Neighbor Totoro, he talks about some of the spirits, as well as, of course, the very famous animated film Spirited Away, where you have a lot of different types of Japanese spirits. So Japanese culture very interested and maintain this belief in spirits, which is strange because we think of Japan as, you know, very modern. And sumo is a reflection of this connection to a spirit kind of culture and spirit kind of tradition. Not spiritual in the Christian, Western or religious way, but a belief in another kind of being other than humans. Alright, so if you ever watch a sumo match, you can check it out yourself online. They have a lot of rituals they have to do to kind of make the spirits happy. A little bit connection to Chinese culture too. You know, we have Qingming, we have certain festivals in Chinese culture where we also have to kind of pay respect to the spirit. Now I'm going to talk about some games. Now sumo, fortunately or unfortunately, because it's seen as funny, you know, you have a bunch of big size guys and trying to get them to do funny things is seen as a humorous way to think about games. So I'm going to show you a few. I'm going to go to, can you all see the website?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So this is a recent free multiplayer game. You can actually download it on Steam, and it's called Circle of Sumo. I'm not trying to say it's trying to be sumo. In fact, it's a different way of looking at sumo. And you can see the game has different kinds of characters, different races. They're not all Japanese. There's women there as well. By the way, in traditional sumo, women totally not allowed at all. Right? So sumo is a very male sport. Traditionally, because samurai are all men, and Japan is quite a patriarchal society. I would even say sometimes sexist. And if you look at sumo, I'm just going to go back to the slide for 1 minute here. This particular place they're standing, like the stage, okay? Now, a woman can never step on this stage, okay, according to the rules of sumo. Now, if a woman were to step on this stage, because the stage is seen as like a sacred place, because all these sumo wrestlers are channeling spirit, so it's a kind of spiritual sacred space. If a woman were to step on the stage, it's considered something like it made the space like no longer sacred, or what you call desecrate the space. Now, this happened a few years ago. I can't remember, I forget exactly when, but there was an incident, a famous incident, where one sumo wrestler collapsed while fighting. I think he had a heart attack or something, and he had a medical emergency. He just like fainted, and the emergency team had to come to revive him, right, so he won't die. And the emergency team had a woman in it, and of course it's emergency, so all went onto the stage to save this guy, and all the officials were like, force the emergency team to leave the stage, cannot save the guy because there's a woman there. So it caused a huge controversy in the sumo world, because then people were saying, oh, so you don't care about people's lives, you're so sexist, as long as a woman stepped there, if the person can be saved by the woman, we don't want him to be saved because the woman has made this space not sacred. So that created controversy. It made people question, is it right or wrong to have these kinds of tradition? And it was the first time in thousands of years that you had a woman step on the stage. So that tells you a lot about how patriarchal Japanese society actually is. But going back to this now, okay, where was I? Here. Alright, so I'm back on this screen. So that was just a side note. So for this particular game, this is how the game looks like. Alright, you can see here, it's kind of like an arena base. And of course, they're trying to be like super, super funny. So you have cars in the sumo stage. Obviously, they are not taking the sacred sumo stage seriously. And you have almost like a kind of like a, I don't know what you call it. It's almost like someone trying to shoot them. They have a cross hatching over there. I mean, sorry, like you're gonna shoot them in the shooting range. Then you have the 8 wrestlers. Then I think they even have DLC now. I'm not really sure how they make money of it. And they actually like won some awards, which is cool. And who made this game? These 4 people. And are any of them Japanese? No, they're not. And am I surprised? Of course I'm not. Because if they are Japanese and they made this game, probably they're going to get trashed by Japanese people. Right? Because it's like, hey, this is our very ancient traditional culture. How dare you make a game that makes fun of our culture? So it makes sense none of them are Japanese. But it also tells you if you're not from that culture, you can do things that people from that culture probably couldn't do because of out of respect or fear that they will get some kind of backlash. So that's one. And then I'm going to move to, okay, so this one I'm going to just show you because this is the funniest, or most people consider the funniest sumo game ever. So I'll show you a quick trailer. So this is like a platform game. So essentially, what is the game about? So I'm just gonna say something while you watch the gameplay. According to the story, this sumo man, he's a hero. He finished a sumo tournament, he was the champion, and he returned back to Japan. Oh, sorry, not Japan, back to his village. And when he came back to his village, he found that everybody was asleep and cursed. So his job is actually to try to wake them up from this cursed sleep. And he has to move through this village and all the buildings in order to basically complete a puzzle, and then that will wake his villagers or his fellow villagers. And of course, the story is basically like nothing. The characters, no development. All of it is just trying to make fun, trying to have some element of humor. And a lot of people play this game and basically find it very funny because the sumo man, he easily falls down and he sometimes cannot get up, and he has trouble balancing in certain kinds of tricky situations, as you can see there. And his goal is actually to do the sumo moves, like banging on the ground, as you can see there. And he's trying to jump. Sometimes he doesn't jump too well. And I'm just gonna end that here. But the beauty of this game is people love to play it to make the sumo man fall down. So it's kind of like a physics balancing game. And when you read some of the reviews, some people are just purely playing it so they can trash the character. I won't say it's the best game ever, but it is a game designed to make fun of it. And no surprise, who are the developers? They are a small Russian development company, basically two-man team, two brothers, and this is the game they created. So again, not Japanese. And the last one, slightly different, not really using sumo people, is this game here. So this is a multiplayer game. I'll just show you a quick snippet. Okay, so obviously quite different, not using the typical sumo wrestler look. And I would say it's trying a little bit not to, you know, make fun too much, unlike the other two. And who are the developers? There you can see them here. So again, these are good examples of very small companies. Again, no Japanese at all, right? And majority of the time you can see they're basically two developers, these two people, and then these are some of their friends. Similar with the earlier teams as well. So moral of the story, if you're Japanese, it's probably impossible for you to make a game about sumo that's funny, because Japanese people will not be too happy. Alright, so this is the last slide about ancient games. If you look back at some of the games I've talked about, I didn't talk about everything. I am talking about the ones that are still active, still popular, people still care a lot about them. And there are common factors, 6 factors that are common, and I would guarantee most of these factors are also common to the games that are digital, that you play and you buy on Steam, and that you might create when you later get into the industry. So as you can see from the list, all of them are exciting in some way, dramatic in some way, whether you are, you know, cutting your head off as a sacrifice, or whether you are wrestling the guy and trying to kill him. Dramatic elements are there, very action based. Okay, competition is a huge part of games, not just sports but board games, very competitive. Remember what I said about the Tibetan leader and the legend of the Go game, to compete to win his country. And then also, of course, rules, right? Rules determine what kind of action you do or what kind of moves you make. Structure, definitely have a way to start, a way to end. Some endings are worse than others. You can get killed or dead. And then at the end, of course, objective, which is to win. So in a sense, you could say all of them have this thing in common. And the last one, which is winning, is, I wouldn't say is so common to all games now. If you look at some of the games that are available on Steam, the goal is not to win. Sometimes the goal is just to keep playing, or the goal is to enjoy an experience. So number 6, I would say, may not be true of all games, even modern games. But number 1 to 5, I would definitely say is part and parcel of games. Even games that don't seem to have a lot of competition with other players, you might be competing against yourself, right? So that's also a form of competition.